Welcome back to our study on the book of Colossians. Today we're going to cover Paul the Apostle from Colossians chapter 1 verse 24 through chapter 2 and verse 7. And if you haven't already, go back and watch our previous videos because that's going to set you up to what Paul is going to be talking about this class. And we're going to start out with Paul's calling as an apostle from verses 24 through 28. Now the word apostle gets tossed around a lot in church and religious circles. And the word apostle in the Bible literally only means someone who is sent, maybe with a message, maybe with some kind of task to do. So really, if Morgan sent me to the store to go and buy milk and other things, then I am Morgan's apostle sent to the store on that journey or mission. And Paul calls himself an apostle born out of due time in 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 8. And what he means there is that he was not the traditionally called apostle like the other 12 were. The other 12 were picked from the beginning. They had been with Jesus. They had been his disciples and seen him on his earthly ministry. Paul in Acts chapter 9 was a different story. He was actually a persecutor of the church, didn't want anything to do with Jesus the Christ. But then Jesus came and flipped his life around and commissioned him to be his one sent on a mission or journey. And Jesus had a particular mission in mind for Paul. Paul was going to be an apostle sent to the Gentiles. And in Ephesians chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, Paul talks extensively about his mission to the Gentiles, how Jesus had commissioned him, and how the Gentiles can also have this hope through Christ. And in this section, Paul's writing to them about the same thing. That's his ministry. He is an apostle sent to the Gentiles, and so he wants these Colossian readers to know as well that's also his mission for them. And in verse 28, he talks about how the entire reason he's writing to them is that he wants them to mature into the image of Christ. And really, that was Paul's aim for all of his letters. Paul's not writing these letters willy-nilly just because he's bored in prison. He's writing all these letters so that Christians can mature into the image of Christ. And so as modern readers, whenever we read these books like Colossians, our aim also should be to grow closer to Christ. That's a good personal goal for us. So as we're reading this book, we need to consider, am I purposely taking these steps and learning from what Paul's writing to grow closer to Christ? And then we move on to chapter 1, verse 29 through chapter 2 and verse 3, talking about Paul's struggle. It's well documented that Paul suffered a lot for the gospel. But in this section of scripture, he's making it very clear that he considered his suffering a privilege. And in chapter 2 and verse 1, he wanted them to know how much he was suffering for their benefit. And interestingly, he says he wanted this letter also passed to the city of Laodicea as well. Remember back to our first video, this was a sister town of Colossae. Laodicea was much larger, but apparently there was already a church in Laodicea that Paul wanted this letter to go to as well. And remember, Paul was writing this letter to Christians who he had never met. And it's one thing for him to write to people who he loves, who he struggled with, and who he's worked with. But in verse 2 of chapter 2, he says that he had never met these Christians face to face. And so Paul is using his sufferings for the sake of Christ and his church. In Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 through 14, he talks pretty extensively about all the things he's doing while he's a prisoner of Rome. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard, and to all the rest my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. And that brings up a really challenging idea for us, because one thing is guaranteed, and that's suffering and unfortunately death. And what Paul's example here shows us is that we get to choose how we use our suffering. You don't get to choose if you're going to suffer or not, but we get to choose how we're going to use our suffering. And the same thing could be said about guilt, about the sin that we have on us in our previous lives. We can either decide to let those things slow us down and weigh us down, or we could shed those things off and use them to our benefit. Paul talks all the time about boasting in his weakness as a strength of the gospel. And so it's very important for him in this section to let them know that he's the apostle sent to them for this specific purpose, and that he's struggling in this process to make sure that they know these things, ultimately to mature into the image of Christ. And lastly, in chapter 2, verses 4 through 7, Paul's going to write about the reason he's writing to them in the first place. In verse 4, he strongly encourages them not to let anyone knock them off the course they are going. And continuing in verses 5 through 7, he says he's encouraged to hear about their faithfulness. As we're going to talk about in the next class, there were a lot of spiritual things and issues and difficulties that these Colossians were facing. There were false gods, there were rumors, and the Bible calls it asceticism. And Paul says, you don't need any of that stuff. Don't let anybody tell you anything differently. What you're doing right now is the exact thing you need to be doing. And I think if Paul could write us a letter today, a letter to the church at Center Chapel in Mount Juliet, Tennessee, I think that would largely be his gist of the letter. And sure, there would be some things that need correcting and certain things that are particular to our congregation probably that he could identify. But overall, the point of the message would be, stay the course. You guys know what to do. You've studied these things. You've received the gospel. Now, all you really have to do is just go and do it. And that's something that's incredibly relevant to modern readers because there are a billion different things in our lives now more than ever that can pull us a billion different ways. And if there's one thing we need to learn about what Paul's saying here, is that we need to find the most important thing of all of those billion things, which is the gospel. Stay faithful to it. Don't let anybody drag you in any different direction. And just like that, we are done with this section from the letter to the Colossians. We would encourage you to go ahead and read forward for next week in chapter 2, verses 8 through 23, where Paul's going to identify specifically some of those things that the Colossians are dealing with. As always, don't forget to look in the link in the description of this video or on the website we're posting it on. We've got some study guide questions for you to consider in your own life that hopefully will help you along your spiritual journey. And we sincerely hope this study is bringing you closer to Christ, helping you understand better who He is and who you need to be because of who He is. We'll see you next time.